Blackwells Wisdom. Lady Cecily of Ravensshire had spent years avoiding Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's most feared enforcer. But when he found her in the garden at dusk, his grip firm on her wrist, she knew her time had run out. Chapter 1. The Falcon and the Dove. The lavender bushes, heavy with late summer bloom, did little to mask the scent of fear that clung to Lady Cecily of Ravensshire. It was a primal scent, sharp and metallic, one she'd hoped to leave behind within the cold, stone walls of Ravensshire Castle. But here, in the relative sanctuary of the Queen's herb garden, bathed in the dying embers of the day, it pursued her still. The sun, a molten coin sinking below the western horizon, cast long, skeletal shadows that stretched and writhed like the anxieties coiling in her stomach. She'd chosen this secluded spot, tucked away behind a high hedge of yew, for a few stolen moments of peace. A reprieve from the suffocating formality of the king's court, a place where the whispers of ambition and the cloying sweetness of veiled threats didn't reach. Here, she could almost pretend she was still the girl who'd raced through these gardens years ago, before the weight of her family name, before the shadow of her brother's treason, had settled upon her like a shroud. Cecily plucked a sprig of rosemary, crushing it between her fingers, inhaling the pungent fragrance in a futile attempt to calm her racing pulse. Her brother, Edmund, had been branded a traitor 3 years past, accused of plotting against King Alaric. He'd vanished before the king's justice, swift and merciless, could claim him. Cecily, though deemed innocent by the king himself, had remained under a perpetual cloud of suspicion, her every move watched, her every word scrutinized. Her freedom was an illusion, a gilded cage crafted by the king's wary benevolence. A rustle in the nearby rose bushes, heavy with their crimson blooms, sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. She'd learned to distinguish the sounds of the garden, the gentle murmur of the fountain, the drone of bees, the chirping of crickets. This was different, deliberate, a predator's approach. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, jeweled dagger concealed beneath the folds of her emerald gown. A futile gesture, she knew, against the man who now emerged from the shadows. Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's enforcer, the Falcon. He was taller than she remembered, his presence filling the small space, eclipsing the fading light. His face, weathered and scarred, was a tapestry of battles fought and won. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a chilling intensity that seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed facade. He wore no armor, only a dark, unadorned tunic and breeches, yet the aura of power that radiated from him was more formidable than any steel plate. The silver falcon, the king's sigil, was embroidered on his chest, a stark reminder of his unwavering loyalty. Cecily had spent the last 3 years meticulously avoiding him, a delicate dance of evasion performed within the confines of the court. She knew his reputation: ruthless, unforgiving, the instrument of the king's will, wielded without mercy or hesitation. He was the hunter, and she, the prey, constantly circling, desperately seeking an escape that never materialized. Lady Cecily, his voice was deep, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. It held no warmth, no trace of courtesy, only a cold, hard edge that sent a fresh wave of fear washing over her. She straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Years of courtly training, of masking her emotions behind a veil of composure, came to her aid. Sir Nicholas, I was not aware you frequented the Queen's gardens. Her voice, she was relieved to find, was steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. He moved closer, his shadow engulfing her. She could smell the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to him, a stark contrast to the sweet perfume of the flowers surrounding them. The king has a task for you, he said, his words clipped and precise. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it with every fiber of her being. The king's tasks were never simple, never without consequence. And for her, a woman tainted by association, they were likely to be perilous. And what task is that? She asked, striving to maintain an air of detached curiosity, as if this were a mere social call, a polite exchange between acquaintances. He stopped mere inches from her, his gaze unwavering. She could see the faint lines etched around his eyes, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his hand instinctively rested on the hilt of the sword that hung, unseen, beneath his tunic. "He wishes you to marry," he stated bluntly, the words falling like stones into the quiet stillness of the garden. Marriage. The word echoed in her mind, a hollow, mocking sound. She'd expected many things: imprisonment, exile, even death, but not this. Marriage was a tool of alliance, a means of securing power and loyalty. For her, it was a sentence, a binding contract that would forever tie her to the king's will, stripping her of the last vestiges of her independence. "And who is the fortunate groom?" she asked, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She knew the answer, could feel it in the cold certainty of Warwick's gaze, in the oppressive silence that had fallen over the garden. He paused, the silence stretching, taut and unbearable. Then he spoke, his voice devoid of any inflection, as if delivering a death sentence. "Me." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Cecily felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and clammy. Marry him? The king's enforcer? The man who embodied everything she feared and loathed? It was a cruel jest, a twisted irony that mocked her very existence. She wanted to laugh, a hysterical, desperate sound that would shatter the suffocating silence. But she couldn't. She could only stare at him, her mind reeling, struggling to comprehend the enormity of the king's decree. "I do not understand," she finally managed to whisper, the words barely audible. "The king believes a union between us will quell any lingering doubts about your loyalty," Warwick said, his gaze unwavering. "It will also discourage any further attempts by your brother to destabilize the realm." Her brother, Edmund. Always it came back to him. His actions, his choices, had cast a long, dark shadow over her life, a shadow she could never escape. "And if I refuse?" she asked, the question a desperate, futile plea. She knew the answer, had known it from the moment Warwick had stepped out of the shadows. Refusal was not an option. It never had been. His eyes narrowed, the steel in them hardening. "You will not refuse, Lady Cecily. The king's will is not to be questioned." He reached out, his hand closing around her wrist. His grip was firm, not painful, but unyielding. A tangible representation of the chains that now bound her to him, to the king, to a fate she had never chosen. "Come," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The king awaits." Cecily looked at his hand on her wrist, the dark contrast of his skin against her pale flesh. She looked at his face, unyielding and impassive, a mask that hid whatever thoughts or emotions might lie beneath. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that her life, as she had known it, was over. The dove, caught in the falcon's grip, had no hope of escape. The game was over, and she had lost. The only question now was how she would survive the marriage. And what price this union, forged in the shadows of the king's watchful eye, would ultimately demand. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Stone Halls. The walk to the king's solar felt longer than any journey Cecily had ever undertaken. Each echoing footstep on the cold flagstones seemed to mark the passing of another piece of her former life, another step closer to the unknown future that awaited her. Sir Nicholas walked beside her, not touching her, yet his presence was a constant, suffocating weight. He was a silent sentinel, a living embodiment of the king's power and her own lack of it. The corridors of the castle, usually bustling with activity, servants hurrying about their duties, courtiers whispering secrets in alcoves, guards standing at attention, seemed eerily deserted. It was as if the very stones held their breath, anticipating the storm that was about to break. Or perhaps, Cecily thought with a flicker of dark humor, they were simply giving the king's enforcer a wide berth. She focused on the details around her, clinging to the familiar sights and sounds as a drowning woman might cling to a piece of driftwood. The tapestries depicting scenes of ancient battles and mythical beasts, the flickering torchlight casting dancing shadows on the walls, the faint scent of incense wafting from the nearby chapel, all these things had been a constant backdrop to her life, a source of comfort and stability. Now, they felt like relics of a bygone era, reminders of a world she was about to lose. She tried to recall the last time she had truly felt free, truly at peace. It seemed a lifetime ago, before Edmund's betrayal had shattered her world. She remembered riding her favorite mare, Firefly, through the fields surrounding Ravensshire, the wind whipping through her hair, the sun warm on her face. She remembered laughing with her cousins, sharing secrets and dreams in the privacy of her chambers. She remembered the comforting presence of her mother, her gentle hands soothing away her childish fears. All gone, lost to the relentless march of time and the cruel hand of fate. Her mother had died a year after Edmund's disappearance, her heart broken by the shame and uncertainty. Cecily had been left alone, a solitary figure in a court filled with suspicion and intrigue. She had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life, to smile when she wanted to scream, to agree when she wanted to protest, to hide her true feelings behind a mask of carefully crafted indifference. But this was different. This was a challenge she didn't know how to face. Marriage to Sir Nicholas Warwick was not simply a political maneuver, it was a sentence. A life sentence. She glanced at him, trying to discern some hint of emotion in his stoic profile. He remained impassive, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his expression unreadable. What was he thinking? Did he resent this union as much as she did? Or did he see it merely as another duty, another task to be performed in service to the king? She knew so little about him, despite his constant presence at court. He was a man of few words, a man who preferred action to conversation. He was renowned for his skill in battle, his unwavering loyalty to the king, and his ruthless efficiency in carrying out his orders. He was a warrior, a weapon, a tool. And now, she was to be his wife. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through her. She imagined his hands, so skilled at wielding a sword, touching her. She imagined his eyes, so cold and calculating, looking at her with what? Desire? Contempt? She didn't know, and the uncertainty was almost unbearable. They reached the King's Solar, a large, imposing room dominated by a massive oak table and a high-backed throne. King Alaric was seated at the table, studying a map spread out before him. He was a tall, powerfully built man, his hair and beard streaked with silver, his face etched with the lines of responsibility and the weariness of ruling a kingdom perpetually on the brink of war. He looked up as they entered, his keen blue eyes assessing them both with a single, penetrating glance. Cecily, Nicholas, he said, his voice resonant and commanding. You are here. It was not a question. Cecily curtsied deeply, her movements graceful and practiced. Your Majesty. Warwick bowed, his movements equally precise. My liege. The king gestured for them to approach. I have made a decision, he said, his voice devoid of any preamble. A decision that I believe is in the best interests of the realm and of you both. He paused, his gaze sweeping over them. Cecily felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew what was coming, yet she couldn't help but cling to a sliver of hope, a desperate, irrational belief that somehow she could escape this fate. You will be married, the king declared, his words echoing the pronouncement Warwick had made in the garden. As soon as arrangements can be made. There it was. The final, irrevocable decree. Her fate sealed. Cecily remained silent, her head bowed, her hands clenched tightly in the folds of her gown. She couldn't speak, couldn't protest, couldn't even look at the king. This union, the king continued, will serve several purposes. It will strengthen the bonds between your two houses, both loyal to the crown. It will quell any lingering doubts about Cecily's allegiance. And it will send a clear message to any who might consider challenging my authority. He looked directly at Cecily, his gaze softening slightly. I know this is unexpected, Cecily, but I believe it is for the best. Nicholas is a good man, a loyal man. He will protect you. Protect her? From whom? From himself? The irony was almost too much to bear. I understand, Your Majesty, she managed to say, her voice a mere whisper. The words were a lie, of course. She didn't understand. She understood nothing except that her life had been irrevocably altered, that she was being forced into a marriage with a man she feared and did not know. The king nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. Good. Nicholas, you will see to the arrangements. I want this done quickly, quietly. There will be no grand celebrations, no unnecessary fanfare. The kingdom is in a precarious state, and we cannot afford any distractions. As you command, my liege, Warwick replied, his voice calm and unwavering. The king dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Go now. And may the gods be with you both. As they left the solar, Cecily felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was trapped. There was no escape. She was to be the wife of the falcon, a pawn in the king's game, a sacrifice to his ambition. The whispers in the stone halls had become a deafening roar, a chorus of voices chanting her doom. And as she walked beside the silent, imposing figure of Sir Nicholas Warwick, she wondered if she would ever find her own voice again, or if she was destined to remain forever silent, a prisoner of her fate, a shadow in the king's watchful eye. The weight of her future pressed down, heavy as the ancient stones of the castle itself. Chapter 3. The King's Decree. The silence between Cecily and Sir Nicholas stretched, taut and heavy, as they walked away from the king's solar. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, unexpressed emotions, and the chilling weight of the king's decree. Cecily felt as though she were walking through a dream, a nightmare from which she couldn't awaken. The reality of her situation, her impending marriage to the king's most feared enforcer, was almost too much to comprehend. She stole another glance at Sir Nicholas. His profile was still set in that impassive mask, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. Did he feel anything at all? Regret? Resignation? Perhaps even a flicker of satisfaction? She couldn't tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. Finally, as they reached the end of a long, dimly lit corridor, he spoke, his voice low and measured. You will have Raven's hire. The words, stark and unexpected, startled her. She stopped, turning to face him. What? He met her gaze, his eyes, for the first time, showing a hint of something other than cold detachment. It wasn't warmth, exactly, but perhaps a flicker of understanding. The king has granted you Raven's Hire Castle and its surrounding lands as your dowry. Raven's Hire, her ancestral home, the place where she had spent her childhood, the place that held so many memories, both joyful and painful. She had assumed it was lost to her, confiscated by the crown after Edmund's betrayal. The thought of returning, of reclaiming her heritage, sent a surge of unexpected emotion through her. Hope, perhaps? Or was it merely the instinct to cling to anything familiar in this sea of uncertainty? Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shrugged, a slight movement of his broad shoulders. The king believes it will appease you and demonstrate his generosity. Cecily snorted, a soft, humorless sound. Generosity? He forces me into a marriage with a man I barely know, a man I fear, and he calls it generosity? Warwick remained silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. He could have taken everything, Lady Cecily. He could have imprisoned you, exiled you, even executed you. Your brother's actions warranted such measures. She knew he was right. She had lived under the shadow of that threat for 3 years, constantly aware of the precariousness of her position. The king's benevolence, as he called it, had been a calculated move, a way of controlling her, of keeping her close, where he could watch her. And now this marriage was simply another form of control, a more permanent, more binding chain. And what about you, Sir Nicholas? She asked, her voice laced with a hint of defiance. What do you gain from this arrangement? He looked away, his gaze shifting to the stone wall beside them. I serve the king, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I do as he commands. Is that all? She pressed, refusing to let him evade the question. Is there nothing personal in this for you? He turned back to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. I am a soldier, Lady Cecily. I am not a man of personal desires. I have a duty to fulfill, and I will fulfill it. His words were like a slap in the face. They confirmed what she had already suspected, that he saw her as nothing more than a duty, a responsibility, a means to an end. She was a pawn in the king's game, and he was the player, moving her across the board according to his master's will. And what if I do not wish to be fulfilled? She asked, the words trembling on her lips. He stepped closer, his presence once again overwhelming. You have no choice, Lady Cecily. The king has decreed it, and I will not allow you to defy him. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. He was the king's enforcer after all. He would not hesitate to use force, if necessary, to ensure her compliance. She felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, rise within her. For years, she had been passive, compliant, accepting her fate with quiet resignation. But this was too much. She would not be a silent, submissive bride. She would not surrender her will, her spirit, without a fight. I may have no choice about the marriage, Sir Nicholas, she said, her voice shaking with barely suppressed fury. But I do have a choice about how I will live it. I will not be your prisoner. I will not be your puppet. I will be Lady Cecily of Ravensshire, and I will retain my dignity, my pride, even in this forced union. His eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by her outburst. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a flicker of something respect crossed his face. As you wish, Lady Cecily, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. But do not mistake my accommodation for weakness. I will do what is necessary to ensure the king's peace, and to protect you whether you wish it or not. Protect her? The word echoed in her mind, a hollow, mocking sound. She didn't need his protection. She needed her freedom. She needed to escape this gilded cage, this suffocating world of courtly intrigue and political machinations. But as she looked into his eyes, those cold, gray eyes that had witnessed so much violence and bloodshed, she saw something else, something that made her pause. A flicker of loneliness, perhaps? A hint of vulnerability? Or was it merely a reflection of her own desperate longing for connection, for understanding, in this cold, unforgiving world? She didn't know. And as they stood there, in the dimly lit corridor, the silence between them once again filled with unspoken words, she realized that this marriage, this forced union, was not simply a matter of duty or politics. It was a battle of wills, a clash of personalities, a dance of deception and desire. And she, Lady Cecily of Ravensshire, was determined to survive it, to emerge from it stronger, more resilient, and perhaps even loved. But love seemed a distant, impossible dream, a fragile flower blooming in the harsh landscape of the king's decree. She had to prepare for a different kind of life, a life of strategic alliances and hidden strengths. Chapter 4. A bargain struck in shadows. The days following the king's decree passed in a blur of hurried preparations and hushed conversations. Cecily found herself swept along in a tide of activity, her own feelings and desires largely ignored. Seamstresses were summoned, fabrics were chosen, jewels were selected, all for a wedding she did not want, to a man she barely knew. She moved through the motions, outwardly compliant, inwardly rebellious. She attended fittings, reviewed guest lists, and endured endless discussions about seating arrangements and menus. But her mind was elsewhere, constantly searching for a way out, a loophole, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped her. She had considered appealing to the Queen, a kind and compassionate woman who had always shown Cecily a degree of sympathy. But she knew it was futile. The Queen, though powerful in her own right, would not dare to challenge the king's will, especially on a matter of such political significance. She had also considered simply running away, disappearing into the night, just as her brother had done. But where would she go? She had no allies, no resources, no one to turn to. And Warwick, with his network of spies and informants, would undoubtedly track her down and bring her back. She was trapped as surely as if she were locked in a tower. One evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, staring out at the darkening sky, a knock on the door startled her. It was Warwick. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had barely spoken to him since their encounter in the corridor, their interactions limited to brief, formal exchanges in the presence of others. She wasn't sure she was ready to face him alone, to confront the reality of their impending union. But she had no choice. She straightened her shoulders, composed her features, and opened the door. He stood in the hallway, his tall figure silhouetted against the flickering torchlight. He was not wearing his usual dark tunic, but a more formal attire, a deep blue doublet embroidered with silver thread, a heavy cloak draped over his shoulders. He looked different, less like a warrior, more like a nobleman. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice surprisingly hesitant. She nodded, stepping aside to allow him entry. He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. The room was sparsely furnished, a large bed draped with heavy curtains, a wooden chest, a writing desk, a few chairs. The only source of light was a single candle burning on the desk, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They stood in silence for a moment, the air thick with tension. Cecily felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. She had no idea what he wanted, what he was going to say. "I wanted to speak with you," he finally said, his voice low and measured. "About the arrangements." She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "What arrangements? The seating? The menu? The flowers?" "I assure you, Sir Nicholas, I have left all those details to the experts." He frowned, a slight crease appearing between his brows. "I am not speaking of the wedding festivities, Lady Cecily. I am speaking of our future. Our future." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Cecily felt a chill run down her spine. "What future?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We have no future. We have a sentence. A life sentence imposed upon us by the king." He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "It does not have to be a sentence, Lady Cecily. It can be something else." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Was he offering her a way out? A compromise? Or was this another one of his tricks, another way of ensuring her compliance? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I know you do not want this marriage," he said. "And I understand your reasons. You fear me, you resent me, you see me as your jailer." She didn't deny it. His words were accurate, reflecting her feelings with unsettling precision. "But I am not your enemy, Lady Cecily," he continued. "And I do not wish to be your jailer. I want this marriage to be tolerable. For both of us. Tolerable. A low bar indeed. But perhaps it was all she could hope for." "And how do you propose to make it tolerable?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. He reached into his doublet, pulling out a small, rolled-up parchment. He held it out to her. "I have drafted an agreement," he said. "A bargain, if you will." She took the parchment, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a surprising, unsettling sensation. She unrolled the parchment, her eyes scanning the carefully written words. It was a prenuptial agreement of sorts. It outlined the terms of their marriage, the division of property, the expectations of behavior. But it also contained some unexpected clauses. Cecily would retain control of Raven's Hire, its finances, its management. She would have the freedom to travel, to visit her friends and family, as long as she informed Warwick of her whereabouts. She would not be required to share his bed until she was ready. The last clause made her breath catch in her throat. It was a concession she had not expected, a glimmer of respect, of understanding, in this otherwise cold and calculated arrangement. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with questions.
"Why?"
she asked. "Why are you doing this?" He shrugged, a slight movement of his broad shoulders. "I told you," he said. "I want this marriage to be tolerable. I am not a monster, Lady Cecily. I do not take pleasure in causing pain or suffering." She studied his face, searching for any hint of deception, any sign that this was a trick. But she saw only sincerity, a genuine desire for what? Peace? Compromise? And what do you ask in return? She asked, her voice still wary. Your loyalty, he said, his voice firm. Not to me, but to the king. Your assurance that you will not betray him, as your brother did. Loyalty. It was a heavy price, a constant reminder of her precarious position. But it was also something she could give, something she had already given, despite her resentment and fear. I have never betrayed the king, she said, her voice firm. And I never will. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. Then we have an agreement, he said. Sign it, and it will be binding. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. This was a gamble, a risk. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to retain some control over her life, to carve out a space for herself within this forced union. The bargain, struck in the flickering shadows of her chamber, offered a fragile truce in the silent war that had been declared between them. It was a beginning, however uncertain, and a new layer to the intricate web of this unexpected pairing. Chapter 5. The Journey to Northwood. The journey to Northwood, the Warwick family estate, was a study in contrasts. The crisp autumn air, alive with the scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke, was a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the court Cecily had left behind. The vibrant tapestry of red, gold, and brown that adorned the rolling hills and dense forests was a welcome change from the gray stone walls and somber tapestries of the castle. Yet, despite the beauty of the surrounding landscape, Cecily found herself unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled upon her like a shroud. She rode beside Sir Nicholas, their horses maintaining a careful distance, their silence punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of hooves and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. They were accompanied by a small escort of Warwick's men-at-arms, silent and watchful figures who rode ahead and behind them, their presence a constant reminder of Cecily's precarious position. She had signed the agreement, the bargain struck in the shadows of her chamber, with a mixture of trepidation and defiance. It was a gamble, a risk, but it was also a chance to retain some semblance of control over her life, to carve out a space for herself within this forced union. She had clung to the concessions Warwick had offered, the control of Ravensshire, the freedom of movement, the delayed intimacy as a drowning woman might cling to a lifeline. But as they rode further and further away from the familiar confines of the court, further into the unknown territory of Warwick's domain, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of apprehension. She was entering his world now, a world where he was the master, where his word was law. The agreement, the fragile truce they had forged, might prove to be nothing more than parchment and ink in the face of his absolute authority. She stole glances at him as they rode. He sat tall and straight in the saddle, his posture radiating confidence and command. He seemed utterly at ease in this environment, his gaze constantly scanning the surrounding landscape, alert to any potential threat. He was a warrior, a protector, a man accustomed to wielding power. And she, despite her defiance, was still his wife, bound to him by the king's decree and her own desperate bargain. They stopped for the night at a small, well-maintained inn, nestled in a clearing beside a rushing stream. Warwick arranged for their accommodations, securing a private room for Cecily and ensuring that his men were stationed strategically around the building. He was meticulous in his attention to detail, anticipating every need, every potential danger. As Cecily sat alone in her room, the sounds of the murmur of voices, the clatter of dishes, the crackling of the fire in the hearth filtering through the thin wooden walls, she felt a profound sense of isolation. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. She longed for the comfort of familiar faces, the companionship of friends, the solace of her own home. She thought of Ravensshire, of the rolling hills and verdant fields, of the ancient castle that had been her family's home for generations. The thought of returning, of reclaiming her heritage, gave her a flicker of strength, a renewed sense of purpose. She would not be broken by this marriage, by this forced exile. She would survive, she would adapt, and she would find a way to thrive, even in this unfamiliar and potentially hostile environment. The next day's ride was even more challenging. The terrain grew steeper, the forests denser, the air colder. They were entering the heart of Warwick's territory, a land that reflected the harsh and unforgiving nature of its lord. As they rode through a particularly dense section of forest, the sunlight filtering through the thick canopy in dappled patterns, Cecily noticed a change in Warwick's demeanor. He became even more alert, his gaze constantly sweeping the surrounding trees, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on a point ahead of them. Then he raised his hand, signaling the escort to halt. "We're being watched," he said, his voice low and tense. Cecily felt a chill run down her spine. She scanned the trees, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw nothing, heard nothing, except the rustling of leaves and the distant caw of a crow.
"Who?" she asked.
"Bandits?" He shook his head.
"Possibly."
"Or something else." "Something else." The words hung in the air, ominous and unsettling. Cecily knew that this land, like any other, had its share of dangers, wild animals, outlaws, feuding clans. But Warwick's tone suggested something more, something supernatural. He dismounted, drawing his sword. He motioned for Cecily to stay where she was, protected by the escort. He moved forward, slowly and cautiously, his eyes fixed on the shadows beneath the trees. Cecily watched him, her breath held captive in her chest. She felt a strange mix of fear and admiration. He was a warrior, fearless and skilled, protecting her from whatever danger lurked in the shadows. It was a role she had never expected him to play, a role that challenged her preconceived notions about him. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. It was not a bandit, nor a wild animal. It was an old woman, her face wrinkled and weathered, her eyes dark and piercing. She wore a simple, homespun dress, and her gray hair was bound in a thick braid. Warwick lowered his sword slightly, but remained wary.
"Who are you?"
he asked, his voice sharp and commanding. The old woman smiled, a slow, knowing smile that revealed a few missing teeth. "I am Alara," she said, her voice raspy but surprisingly strong. "And I have been waiting for you." "Waiting for them?" Cecily felt a shiver of unease. This encounter, so unexpected and so strange, seemed to carry a weight of significance she couldn't quite grasp. The journey to Northwood had taken an unexpected turn into a realm where the mundane and the mystical seemed to intertwine. And Cecily, caught in the middle, felt the first stirrings of a premonition, a sense that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined, far beyond a simple political marriage. Chapter 6. Scars of the Past. Alara, the old woman who had emerged from the forest, led them to a small, secluded cottage nestled deep within the woods. It was a humble dwelling, constructed of rough-hewn logs and a thatched roof, yet it possessed a certain charm, a sense of peace and tranquility that belied the wildness of the surrounding landscape. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, carrying the scent of wood smoke and herbs, a welcoming aroma that eased some of Cecily's apprehension. Warwick remained wary, his hand never far from his sword, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He clearly did not trust Alara, despite her seemingly harmless appearance. Cecily, however, felt a strange sense of familiarity, a sense that she had met this woman before, perhaps in a dream. Alara invited them inside, offering them food and drink. The interior of the cottage was surprisingly cozy, filled with the comforting clutter of a life lived close to nature. Herbs hung from the rafters, drying in the warmth of the hearth. Jars of various sizes lined the shelves, filled with colorful powders and mysterious liquids. A large, wooden loom stood in one corner, a half-finished tapestry depicting scenes of the forest and its creatures. Cecily accepted a cup of herbal tea, its warm, fragrant steam soothing her frayed nerves. Warwick, however, refused any refreshment, his gaze fixed on Alara, his expression unreadable. "You said you were waiting for us," he said, his voice sharp and direct.
Why?
Alara smiled, her dark eyes twinkling with amusement. Because you are needed, Sir Nicholas. Both of you. Needed? Cecily felt a surge of confusion. What could this old woman, living in the middle of nowhere, possibly need from them? I do not understand, Warwick said, his voice laced with suspicion. Alara turned to Cecily, her gaze softening. You are Lady Cecily of Ravensshire, are you not?
She asked.
Cecily nodded, surprised that this woman knew her name. I knew your mother, Alara continued, her voice filled with a hint of sadness. She was a good woman, a kind woman. She had the sight. The sight. Cecily felt a shiver run down her spine. The sight was a rare and mysterious gift, the ability to see into the future, to perceive things beyond the realm of ordinary perception. It was a gift that was both revered and feared, often associated with witchcraft and heresy. My mother had the sight? Cecily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alara nodded. She hid it well, fearing the consequences. But she used it to help others, to heal the sick, to guide those in need. Cecily remembered her mother, her gentle hands, her soothing voice, her uncanny ability to anticipate events, to know things she shouldn't have known. Had it all been a manifestation of the sight? And you have it too? Warwick asked, his voice still skeptical. Alara smiled. I do. And I have seen things. Things that concern you both. She turned to Warwick, her gaze piercing. You carry a heavy burden, Sir Nicholas. Scars of the past that haunt you still. Warwick flinched, as if struck by a physical blow. Cecily saw a flicker of pain, of vulnerability, cross his face, a glimpse behind the mask of stoicism he usually wore. I do not know what you are talking about, he said, his voice tight and controlled. Alara shook her head. You cannot hide from it, Sir Nicholas. It is written on your soul. The death of your wife, the loss of your child, it consumes you. Cecily felt a jolt of shock. She had known nothing of Warwick's past, of any previous marriage or family. The king had never mentioned it, and Warwick himself had certainly never spoken of it. This revelation, so unexpected and so personal, changed everything. Warwick's face was pale, his jaw clenched. He looked as though he were about to explode, to lash out at Alara for daring to speak of such things. Be silent, old woman, he said, his voice dangerously low. Alara remained unfazed. The past cannot be silenced, Sir Nicholas. It must be faced, it must be healed. Or it will destroy you. She turned back to Cecily, her gaze softening again. And you, Lady Cecily, you carry your own scars. The betrayal of your brother, the loss of your mother, the weight of your family's shame, it has wounded you deeply. Cecily felt tears welling up in her eyes. Alara's words, so accurate and so compassionate, struck a chord deep within her. She had tried to bury her pain, to hide it behind a mask of indifference, but it was always there, a constant ache in her heart. I try not to think about it, she whispered, her voice trembling. Alara nodded. But you must think about it, Lady Cecily. You must confront your pain, your fears, your doubts. Only then can you find true healing, true peace. She looked at them both, her gaze encompassing them in a shared moment of vulnerability. You are both wounded souls, she said. But you are also strong, resilient. You have the power to heal each other, to help each other find the light in the darkness. Heal each other? The thought seemed absurd, impossible. How could she, the unwilling bride, heal the wounds of the hardened warrior? How could he, the king's enforcer, offer solace to the woman he was forced to marry? The scars of the past, revealed in the flickering candlelight of Alara's cottage, seemed to form an insurmountable barrier between them. Yet, a fragile seed of hope had been planted, a whisper of possibility in the face of overwhelming pain. And the journey ahead, Cecily realized, would be more than just a physical relocation. It would be a journey of the soul. Chapter 7. The Huntress and the Night. The following morning, Cecily awoke to the sound of birdsong and the smell of wood smoke. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with fragmented images of her mother, her brother, and the enigmatic Alara. The old woman's words, "You are both wounded souls, you have the power to heal each other," echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain that she couldn't quite dismiss. She rose, dressed, and ventured outside the cottage. The air was crisp and cool, the forest bathed in the golden light of the rising sun. Warwick was already up, standing near the edge of the woods, his back to her. He was practicing with his sword, his movements fluid and graceful, yet imbued with a deadly power. She watched him for a moment, mesmerized by his skill. He moved like a predator, his body perfectly balanced, his blade a blur of silver in the sunlight. She had seen him fight before, in tournaments and mock battles at court, but this was different. This was the real Warwick, the warrior stripped bare of any pretense of civility, his raw power and lethal grace on full display. He sensed her presence, turning to face her. He lowered his sword, his expression softening slightly. "Good morning," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still hesitant. She felt awkward, unsure of how to act, how to speak to him after the revelations of the previous evening. He sheathed his sword, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. She shrugged. "Not really. I kept thinking about what Alara said." He nodded, his gaze shifting to the forest. "She speaks in riddles," he said, his voice laced with a hint of bitterness, "and stirs up ghosts best left undisturbed." Cecily sensed his resistance, his reluctance to confront the pain of his past. She understood it, for she felt the same reluctance herself. But Alara's words had struck a chord within her, a deep-seated longing for healing, for peace. "Perhaps," she said softly, but she also spoke of hope, of the possibility of healing. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "Do you believe that?" he asked. "Do you believe that we two strangers, forced together by the king, can heal each other?" She didn't answer immediately.
She didn't know what she believed.
But she knew that she wanted to believe it, that she needed to believe it. "I don't know," she finally said, "but I am willing to try." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then a flicker of something respect, perhaps, crossed his face. "You are a surprising woman, Lady Cecily," he said. "More resilient than I anticipated." She smiled, a faint, tentative smile. "And you, Sir Nicholas, are more complex than I imagined." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that was surprisingly pleasant. "Perhaps we are both more than we seem," he said. He gestured towards the forest.
"Come," he said.
"I will show you something." She followed him into the woods, the sunlight filtering through the trees in dappled patterns. The air was filled with the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant murmur of a stream. He led her to a small clearing where a waterfall cascaded down a rocky cliff face, creating a pool of crystal-clear water below. It was a hidden oasis, a place of beauty and tranquility, far removed from the cares and concerns of the world. "This is where I come to think," he said, his voice soft and reflective. "To find peace." Cecily looked around, marveling at the beauty of the place. She could understand why he found solace here. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from the harsh realities of his life. He sat down on a large, flat rock beside the pool, his gaze fixed on the cascading water. Cecily hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle murmur of the waterfall. Cecily felt a strange sense of connection with him, a shared moment of peace and tranquility. "Alara spoke of your wife," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. He flinched, his body tensing. She immediately regretted her words, fearing that she had crossed a line, intruded upon a pain too deep to bear. But he didn't rebuke her. He simply sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to carry the weight of his sorrow. "Her name was Lyra," he said, his voice hoarse. "She was beautiful,
Kind.
gentle, everything I am not." He paused, his gaze fixed on the water, as if seeing her reflection in its depths. "We were married for only a year," he continued. She died giving birth to our child.
Essel.
He died too. Cecily felt tears welling up in her eyes. She could only imagine the pain he must have endured, the loss that had shattered his world. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine compassion. He shook his head. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but it still haunts me." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that she had never seen before. I blame myself," he said. "I should have been there. I should have protected them." Cecily reached out, her hand instinctively touching his arm. It was a small gesture, a simple act of comfort, but it seemed to break through the wall of reserve he had built around himself. He looked at her hand on his arm, his expression softening. He didn't pull away. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. "It was not your fault." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if struggling to control his emotions. Then he opened them, his gaze meeting hers. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat there for a while longer, the silence between them no longer awkward, but filled with a shared understanding, a nascent connection forged in the crucible of their mutual pain. Cecily, the huntress accustomed to solitude, and Warwick, the knight burdened by his past, had found a moment of unexpected solace in each other's presence. The path ahead remained uncertain, but in the shared silence by the waterfall, a fragile bridge had been built, spanning the chasm of their forced union. It was a small step, but a significant one, towards a future neither could have predicted. Chapter 8. Secrets of the Ancient Forest. After their shared moment of vulnerability by the waterfall, Cecily and Warwick continued their journey to Northwood, a subtle shift having occurred in their dynamic. The silence between them was no longer as strained, the tension less palpable. They spoke little, but their glances held a newfound understanding, a nascent respect born from the shared weight of their pasts. As they rode deeper into the Warwick lands, Cecily began to appreciate the stark beauty of the landscape. The dense forests, the rolling hills, the rushing streams all spoke of a wildness, an untamed spirit that resonated with something deep within her. She had always loved the outdoors, preferring the freedom of the fields and forests to the confines of the castle walls. But this land was different, more ancient, more powerful. She noticed that Warwick, too, seemed to change as they neared his home. He relaxed his guard slightly, his eyes softening, his posture less rigid. He was returning to his element, to the place where he belonged. One afternoon, as they rode along a narrow path winding through a particularly dense section of forest, Warwick suddenly stopped, his gaze fixed on a point ahead of him. "What is it?" Cecily asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the trees. Then, he pointed to a barely discernible trail branching off from the main path. "There," he said, his voice low and quiet. "An old track. Seldom used." He dismounted, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He motioned for Cecily to stay where she was. "Where are you going?"
she asked.
"I want to investigate," he said. "There's something unusual about this." He disappeared into the trees, following the faint trail. Cecily waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She had a feeling, a premonition, that this was more than just a routine patrol. After a few minutes, he returned, his expression grave. "What did you find?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment, as if reluctant to speak. "Signs of passage," he said. "Recent. Several horses. And something else." "What else?" He looked at her, his eyes troubled. "Tracks I've never seen before. Large, clawed like a beast, but different." "A beast?" Cecily felt a shiver of fear. She had heard tales of strange creatures inhabiting these ancient forests, creatures of myth and legend. But she had always dismissed them as folklore, stories told to frighten children. "Could it be a bear?" she asked, trying to sound rational. He shook his head.
"No.
Bears are common in these woods. I know their tracks. This is something else." He remounted his horse, his gaze fixed on the trail. "We need to be careful," he said. "This forest holds secrets. Ancient secrets." They continued their journey, the mood now more somber, more cautious. Cecily found herself constantly scanning the trees, her senses heightened, alert to any unusual sound or movement. As dusk began to settle, they reached a clearing where the ruins of an ancient stone circle stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. The stones were weathered and worn, covered in moss and lichen, their origins lost in the mists of time. Warwick dismounted, his gaze fixed on the stones. "This is a sacred place," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. "A place of power." Cecily felt a strange energy emanating from the stones, a tingling sensation that ran through her body. She had never been particularly superstitious, but she couldn't deny the feeling of something ancient and powerful present in this place. "What kind of power?" she asked. He shrugged.
"I don't know," he said.
"But the old stories speak of rituals performed here long ago. Sacrifices to appease the gods or something else." "Something else?" The words hung in the air, ominous and unsettling. Cecily felt a growing sense of unease. This place, this forest, felt different than anything she had ever experienced. They made camp near the stone circle, Warwick building a fire and ensuring that the escort was positioned strategically around the perimeter. He was taking no chances, his vigilance heightened by the discovery of the strange tracks and the unsettling atmosphere of the ancient ruins. As they sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of bread and cheese, Cecily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Do you think whatever made those tracks is still out there?" She spoke quietly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames.
"Possibly."
"This forest is vast, and much of it is unexplored. There are things here that most people have never seen." "Alara, she seemed to know about them," Cecily said. "She said the forest held secrets." Warwick sighed. "Alara is a strange woman," he said. "She knows things she shouldn't know. But she is also wise. And trustworthy, I believe." He looked away and into the darkness that was consuming everything outside their small fire's light. He continued, "I've heard stories, legends really, of guardians beings older than the kingdom. They say this forest is protected." "Protected from what?"
He was quiet a long time.
Then, so quietly she almost did not hear it, he answered. "From those who would misuse its power." "Misuse its power?" Cecily felt a chill run down her spine. The secrets of the ancient forest, whispered around the flickering campfire, seemed to be drawing closer, weaving a tapestry of mystery and danger around them. She had a feeling that their arrival at Northwood would be more than just a change of residence. It would be an immersion into a world where the boundaries between reality and myth were blurred, where the past held sway over the present, and where the huntress and the knight would be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The air grew colder, as though the forest itself were listening. Chapter 9. The Serpent in the Garden. They reached Northwood the following day. The estate was not a castle, like Ravensshire, but a large, fortified manor house, built of gray stone and surrounded by a high wall. It was imposing, yet it lacked the grandeur and elegance of Cecily's ancestral home. It felt stark, functional, a reflection of its master's personality. As they rode through the gates, Cecily was struck by the silence. There were no welcoming crowds, no cheering servants, no fanfare of any kind. Only a few guards, standing at attention, their faces impassive. Warwick dismounted, handing his reins to a groom. He turned to Cecily, his expression hesitant. "Welcome to Northwood," he said, his voice lacking any warmth or enthusiasm. Cecily dismounted, her own feelings a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. She was entering his domain, his stronghold, the place where he was the undisputed lord. She was a stranger here, an outsider, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of displacement. A woman emerged from the manor house, approaching them with a brisk, efficient stride. She was tall and slender, her hair gray and pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined and weathered. She wore a simple, dark dress, and a large ring of keys hung from her belt. "Sir Nicholas," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Welcome home." Warwick nodded. "Mistress Alara," he said. "This is Lady Cecily, my wife." The use of the word wife sounded strange, forced, even to Cecily's ears. It was a title, a label, that did not yet feel real, that did not reflect the complex and uncertain nature of their relationship. Mistress Alara, not the Alara of the forest. Cecily noted, looked at Cecily, her eyes assessing, her expression unreadable. My lady, she said, with a slight curtsy. I am the housekeeper here. I will see to your needs. Her tone was polite, but not warm. Cecily sensed a hint of resentment, perhaps? Or was it simply the natural reserve of a servant towards a new, and possibly unwelcome, mistress? Cecily nodded. Thank you, Mistress Alara, she said. Warwick turned to the housekeeper. Show Lady Cecily to the West Wing chambers, he said, and see that she has everything she requires. The West Wing. Cecily felt a flicker of relief. It was a separate part of the house, away from Warwick's own chambers. It was a small concession, a tacit acknowledgement of the agreement they had made, the bargain struck in the shadows. Mistress Alara led Cecily inside the manor house. The interior was as stark and functional as the exterior, lacking any ornamentation or decoration. The walls were bare stone, the floors covered in simple rushes, the furniture heavy and unadorned. It was a far cry from the opulent elegance of Ravenhire, or even the relatively comfortable surroundings of the king's court. The West Wing chambers were more spacious than Cecily had expected, consisting of a large bedchamber, a sitting room, and a small dressing room. The windows offered a view of a walled garden, overgrown and neglected, but still possessing a certain wild beauty. Will this be satisfactory, my lady? Mistress Alara asked, her voice devoid of any emotion. Cecily looked around, her feelings a mixture of disappointment and resignation. It was not what she had hoped for, but it was adequate. It was a space she could call her own, a refuge from the unfamiliar and potentially hostile environment of Northwood. It will do, she said, her voice flat. Mistress Alara nodded. I will have your belongings brought up, she said, and I will send a maid to assist you. She turned to leave, but Cecily stopped her. Mistress Alara, she said, how long have you served Sir Nicholas? The housekeeper paused, her back to Cecily. Many years, my lady, she said. Since before the Troubles. The Troubles. Cecily knew what she meant. The death of Warwick's wife and child. The scars of the past that still haunted him. You knew his wife? Cecily asked, her voice hesitant. Mistress Alara turned back to face her, her expression softening slightly. I did, my lady, she said. Lady Lyra was a good woman. A kind woman. She did not deserve what happened to her. Cecily sensed a deep loyalty in the housekeeper's voice, a fierce protectiveness towards her former mistress, and perhaps a hint of disapproval towards Cecily, the woman who had taken her place. I am sorry for your loss, Cecily said, her voice sincere. Mistress Alara nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored Cecily's own. Thank you, my lady, she said. She left the room, closing the door behind her. Cecily was alone, surrounded by the silence of her new chambers, the unfamiliar walls of Northwood. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, a longing for the comfort of familiar faces, the solace of her own home. But that was not an option now. She walked to the window, looking out at the overgrown garden. It was a neglected space, a tangle of weeds and overgrown shrubs, but she saw something else in it, a potential, a possibility. She thought of her time with the Queen, her secret joy. A serpent in the garden. It was an apt metaphor for her situation. She was the outsider, the intruder, the unwelcome guest in this strange and unfamiliar place. But she was also a survivor, a woman of resilience and determination. She would not be broken by this marriage, by this exile. She would find a way to thrive, to create her own space, her own garden within the walls of Northwood. And perhaps, in doing so, she would find a way to heal not only herself, but also the wounded knight who is now her husband. A new resolve filled her, to cultivate beauty and life where there was only neglect and sorrow. Chapter 10. Flames of Rebellion. The first few weeks at Northwood were a period of adjustment, of quiet observation and subtle exploration. Cecily spent much of her time alone, exploring the manor house and its surrounding grounds, familiarizing herself with the routines and rhythms of her new home. She had little contact with Warwick, who seemed to be deliberately avoiding her, occupied with the management of his estate and the training of his men. She began to work in the neglected garden, clearing away the weeds and overgrown shrubs, uncovering the hidden beauty that lay beneath. It was a physical task, demanding and exhausting, but it was also therapeutic, a way of connecting with the earth, of finding solace in the simple act of nurturing and growth. She remembered, with fondness, lessons learned at her mother's side and in secret hours assisting the queen's own gardeners. It was knowledge that had felt like a childish indulgence, then.
Now it was a lifeline.
Mistress Alara, though initially reserved, gradually warmed to Cecily, impressed by her willingness to work, her determination to restore the garden to its former glory. She offered advice, shared her knowledge of local herbs and plants, and even, on occasion, a rare smile. Cecily learned that the garden had been Lyra's passion, a place where she had found peace and solace. It had been neglected after her death, a silent testament to Warwick's grief and his inability to confront the memories it held. One evening, as Cecily was working in the garden, clearing away a tangle of dead vines, she uncovered a small, stone statue of a woman, half hidden beneath the overgrown foliage. It was beautifully carved, depicting a young woman with flowing hair and a gentle smile, holding a bouquet of flowers. She recognized the face. It was Lyra. She felt a pang of something, a complex mixture of sadness, empathy, and perhaps a touch of jealousy. She was living in the shadow of this woman, this ghost, this idealized image of perfection. She was the second wife, the replacement, the woman who could never measure up to the memory of her predecessor. She cleaned the statue, carefully removing the dirt and moss that had accumulated over the years. As she worked, she felt a strange connection to Lyra, a sense of shared experience, of shared loss. They were both women who had loved, who had suffered, who had been bound to the same man, albeit in different ways. She placed the statue in a prominent position in the garden, a tribute to the woman who had created this space, a reminder of the beauty that had been lost and the beauty that could be restored. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Cecily began to feel a growing sense of unease. There were whispers among the servants, rumors of unrest in the neighboring lands, of bandits and outlaws growing bolder, of attacks on isolated farms and villages. Warwick became even more withdrawn, his face grim, his eyes shadowed with worry. He spent long hours in conference with his captain of the guard, poring over maps and dispatches, his brow furrowed in concentration. One evening, as Cecily was sitting alone in her chambers, reading by the light of a single candle, a knock on the door startled her. It was Warwick. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had not spoken to him alone since their conversation by the waterfall weeks ago. She opened the door. He stood in the hallway, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "There has been an attack," he said, his voice hoarse. "On Oakhaven, Lord Ashton's estate." Oakhaven was a neighboring estate, a few hours' ride from Northwood. Cecily had met Lord Ashton once, a kind and jovial man, known for his hospitality and his love of hunting. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They burned it to the ground," Warwick said, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fury. "Killed everyone. Men, women, children, no one was spared." Cecily felt a wave of horror wash over her. She couldn't imagine the terror, the brutality, the senseless loss of life. "Who did this?" she asked. Warwick shook his head. "We don't know," he said. "But there are rumors. Whispers of a rebellion, led by a shadowy figure. Someone who calls himself the Raven." The Raven. The name sent a chill down Cecily's spine. It was a familiar name, a name associated with her brother, Edmund. He had used the raven as his symbol, a sign of defiance against the king. Could it be? Could Edmund be behind this attack, this rebellion? She looked at Warwick, her eyes searching his face. Did he suspect? Did he know of her brother's connection to the raven? "We must prepare," Warwick said, his voice regaining its usual firmness. "We must strengthen our defenses. We must be ready for anything." He turned to leave, but Cecily stopped him. Nicholas, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think it could be my brother? He paused, his back to her. He didn't answer immediately. I do not know, Lady Cecily, he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. But I will find out. And I will deal with it. Whoever it is. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. He was the king's enforcer after all. He would not hesitate to crush any rebellion, to punish any traitor, even if it was her own brother. The flames of rebellion, ignited in the darkness, threatened to consume everything, including the fragile peace Cecily had begun to cultivate at Northwood. And she, caught between her loyalty to the king and the lingering ties of family, found herself standing on the precipice of a conflict that could tear her apart. A new, terrifying uncertainty loomed, larger than any personal struggle. Chapter 11. A Dance of Deception. The news of the attack on Oakhaven cast a long shadow over Northwood. Fear and uncertainty permeated the manor house, the servants whispering in hushed tones, the guards patrolling the walls with increased vigilance. Warwick, consumed by the need to protect his lands and his people, became even more distant, his days and nights filled with preparations for war. Cecily, too, was deeply affected by the news. The possibility that her brother, Edmund, might be behind the attack, that he might be leading a rebellion against the king, filled her with a complex mixture of dread and a flicker of hope. She had not seen Edmund in 3 years, since his sudden disappearance from court. She had believed him to be dead, lost to her forever. But now, the possibility that he was still alive, that he was fighting for something stirred something within her, a dormant sense of loyalty, a yearning for connection with the only family she had left. But she knew she could not reveal her suspicions to Warwick. He was the king's man, duty-bound to crush any rebellion, to punish any traitor, regardless of their identity. If he knew of her brother's possible involvement, he would not hesitate to hunt him down and bring him to justice. She found herself caught in a web of deception, forced to conceal her true feelings, to play the role of the loyal wife, while secretly harboring doubts and anxieties that threatened to consume her. She continued to work in the garden, finding solace in the familiar routine, the comforting rhythm of the earth. The garden had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the fear and uncertainty that permeated the rest of the manor house, a place where she could think and plan and hope. One afternoon, as she was pruning a rose bush, she noticed a small, folded piece of parchment tucked beneath a leaf. It was not there before. She carefully unfolded it, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a message, written in a familiar hand. Edmund's hand. Meet me at the stone circle. Midnight. Tomorrow. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a summons, an invitation to a clandestine meeting, a dangerous gamble that could have dire consequences. She looked around, her eyes scanning the garden, the walls of the manor house, the surrounding forest. Was she being watched? Was this a trap? She didn't know, but she knew she had to go. She had to see Edmund, to hear his side of the story, to find out if he was truly involved in the rebellion. She carefully concealed the message, her mind racing. How would she get away? How would she explain her absence? Warwick was always watchful, always suspicious. She decided to confide in Mistress Alara. The housekeeper, though initially reserved, had become a trusted confidant, a source of support and understanding in this strange and unfamiliar environment. She found Mistress Alara in the kitchen, supervising the preparation of the evening meal. She waited until the other servants had left the room, then she approached her, her voice low and urgent.
Mistress Alara, she said.
I need your help. The housekeeper looked at her, her eyes questioning. Cecily told her about the message, about her brother, about her desperate need to meet him. She omitted only the name Raven, fearing it would raise too many questions. Mistress Alara listened intently, her expression grave. This is dangerous, my lady, she said. Very dangerous. If Sir Nicholas were to find out, I know, Cecily said. But I have to do this. I have to see him. Mistress Alara hesitated for a moment, then she nodded. I will help you, she said. I will create a distraction. I will say you are unwell. I will keep Sir Nicholas occupied. Cecily felt a surge of gratitude. She had found an ally, a partner in this dangerous dance of deception. The following day passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Cecily went through the motions of her daily routine, pretending to be ill, keeping to her chambers, avoiding any contact with Warwick. As midnight approached, she dressed in dark clothing, her heart pounding in her chest. She slipped out of her chambers, the manor house silent and still. Mistress Alara was waiting for her in the hallway, her face pale but determined. "Be careful, my lady," she whispered, "and may the gods be with you." Cecily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She slipped out of the manor house, into the cold night air. The moon was full, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. She made her way to the stone circle, her senses heightened, alert to any sound or movement. The ancient stones loomed before her, silhouetted against the starry sky, their presence both ominous and comforting. She waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. She began to doubt, to fear that Edmund would not come, that it had all been a cruel jest, a trap. Then she heard a sound, a rustling in the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was him, Edmund. He was taller than she remembered, thinner, his face weathered and lined, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and sadness. "Cecily," he said, his voice hoarse. "Edmund," she replied, her voice trembling. They embraced, a brief, desperate hug that conveyed years of separation, of loss, of longing. Then, they stepped apart, their eyes searching each other's faces, seeking answers, seeking reassurance. The dance of deception had led Cecily to this moment, a reunion fraught with danger and uncertainty, a meeting that could change everything. But what truths would be revealed in the moonlit shadows of the ancient stones? And what price would she have to pay for this forbidden encounter? Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty. The reunion between Cecily and Edmund was fraught with tension, a mixture of relief, joy, and a heavy undercurrent of suspicion. They stood in the shadow of the ancient stones, the full moon casting an eerie glow upon their faces, highlighting the years of separation and the vastly different paths they had taken. "You look different," Cecily said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the strained silence. Edmund gave a short, humorless laugh. "So, do you, sister? Marriage to the king's lapdog does not seem to have suited you." Cecily flinched at his words, the barb striking a raw nerve. "It was not my choice, Edmund," she said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "Just as your exile was not yours." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "Do you believe that?" he asked. "Do you believe I had no choice?" She hesitated. She had always believed in Edmund's innocence, in his unwavering loyalty to the king. But the rumors of the rebellion, the attack on Oakhaven, the whispers of the raven, they had planted seeds of doubt in her mind. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Tell me, Edmund. Tell me the truth. Are you leading this rebellion?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant forest, his expression unreadable. "I am fighting for what is right, Cecily," he finally said, his voice low and intense. "For justice. For freedom. For the people who have been oppressed by the king's tyranny." Tyranny? Cecily felt a surge of confusion. The king, though stern and demanding, had always seemed just. He had ruled the kingdom with a firm hand, but he had also maintained peace and stability, protecting his people from external threats. "The king is not a tyrant, Edmund," she said. He is our ruler. He has protected us." Edmund turned back to her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Protected us?" he scoffed. "He has enriched himself and his cronies, while the common people starve. He has imposed unjust taxes, seized lands, imprisoned those who dare to speak out against him. He is a tyrant, Cecily, and he must be stopped." His words were like a slap in the face. She had never heard him speak like this before, so filled with anger and hatred. "But the attack on Oakhaven," she said, her voice trembling. "Innocent people, women, children, they were killed. How can you justify that?" He looked away again, his expression shifting to one of regret. There were mistakes made, he admitted, his voice softer now. Collateral damage. In war, there are always casualties. Casualties? Cecily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. These were not casualties. These were people, lives brutally extinguished. That is not right, Edmund, she said, her voice shaking. You cannot justify the killing of innocents. He turned back to her, his eyes pleading. I am trying to build a better world, Cecily, he said. A world free from oppression, from injustice. Join me, sister. Help me. Join him? The thought was both tempting and terrifying. She longed to be reunited with her brother, to fight alongside him, to reclaim their family's honor. But she also knew that joining him would mean betraying the king, betraying Warwick, betraying everything she had come to accept. I cannot, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I am married. I have obligations. He looked at her, his eyes filled with disappointment and contempt. You have chosen your chains, then, he said, his voice cold and harsh. You have chosen to side with the oppressor. His words stung, cutting her to the core. I have chosen survival, she said, her voice trembling. I have chosen peace. He shook his head. There can be no peace with tyranny, Cecily, he said. Only submission. He turned to leave, disappearing back into the shadows of the forest. Edmund, she called out, her voice desperate. Wait. But he was gone. She was alone, standing in the cold moonlight, her heart aching with a mixture of grief, regret, and a growing sense of dread. She returned to Northwood, her mind reeling, her emotions in turmoil. She had seen her brother. She had heard his words. She had witnessed his transformation. He was no longer the brother she had known and loved, the playful, carefree boy who had shared her childhood. He was a rebel, a warrior, a man consumed by anger and a thirst for vengeance? Justice? She knew she should tell Warwick, reveal Edmund's involvement in the rebellion, betray her brother to save herself. It was the logical thing to do, the loyal thing to do. But she couldn't. She couldn't betray her brother, even if he had become a stranger, even if he was fighting for a cause she could not fully support. She crept back into her chambers, Mistress Alara waiting for her, her face etched with worry. Did you see him? She asked. Cecily nodded, her eyes filled with tears. What will you do? Mistress Alara asked. Cecily didn't answer. She didn't know. She was caught between two loyalties, two worlds, two opposing forces. The price of loyalty, she realized, was far higher than she had ever imagined. And she feared that she would be forced to make a choice that would break her heart, no matter what she decided. The weight of her secret, the knowledge of Edmund's rebellion, pressed down on her, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate her. Chapter 13. Echoes of a Lost Love. The days following Cecily's clandestine meeting with Edmund were filled with a gnawing anxiety, a constant fear of discovery. She moved through the motions of her daily life, tending to the garden, interacting with the servants, even sharing meals with Warwick, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the weight of her secret and the agonizing dilemma she faced. Warwick, preoccupied with the growing threat of rebellion, seemed oblivious to her inner turmoil. He was more distant than ever, his face grim, his eyes shadowed with worry. He spent long hours in conference with his captain of the guard, poring over maps and dispatches, his brow furrowed in concentration. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were curt and businesslike. Cecily found herself longing for the brief moments of connection they had shared, the shared vulnerability by the waterfall, the nascent understanding that had begun to blossom between them. But those moments seemed like a distant dream, lost in the gathering storm of war and betrayal. One afternoon, as she was working in the garden, she noticed a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner of the tool shed. It was old and weathered, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. She had never seen it before. Curiosity overcoming her, she opened the box. Inside, she found a collection of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to Nicholas Warwick in a delicate, feminine hand. She recognized the handwriting. It was Lyra's. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she shouldn't read them, that they were private, personal, a glimpse into a past that was not hers to share.
But she couldn't resist.
She was drawn to them, compelled by a desperate need to understand the man she had married, the woman he had loved, the ghost that haunted their lives. She carefully untied the ribbon, unfolding the first letter. It was dated several years before Lyra's death, a time when she and Warwick were newly married, deeply in love. The letters were filled with tenderness, with affection, with the simple joys and everyday concerns of a young couple building a life together. Lyra wrote of her love for Warwick, her admiration for his strength and his kindness, her hopes and dreams for their future. She wrote of her passion for the garden, her joy in creating a space of beauty and tranquility. She wrote of her longing for a child who would carry on their legacy. As Cecily read the letters, she felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She could feel Lyra's presence, her spirit, her essence, captured in the delicate strokes of her pen. She could understand why Warwick had loved her so deeply, why her loss had devastated him so completely. She also felt a pang of jealousy, a flicker of resentment towards this woman, this ghost, who still held such a powerful sway over Warwick's heart. She was the second wife, the replacement, the woman who could never measure up to the memory of her predecessor. But as she continued to read, her jealousy gradually gave way to empathy, a sense of shared experience, of shared loss. She, too, had loved and lost. She, too, had known the pain of separation, of betrayal, of shattered dreams. She found a letter, dated just a few weeks before Lyra's death. In it, Lyra wrote of her fears, her anxieties about the impending birth of her child. She wrote of her love for Warwick, her unwavering faith in him, her belief that he would protect her, that he would always be there for her. Cecily felt tears welling up in her eyes. She knew how that story ended. She knew that Warwick had not been there, that he had been unable to protect Lyra, that he had lost both his wife and his child. She carefully folded the letters, placing them back in the box. She had intruded upon a sacred space, a private grief, and she felt ashamed. But she had also gained a deeper understanding of Warwick, of his pain, of his humanity. She closed the box, her mind racing. She knew she had to tell him about the letters, that she had to confess her transgression. But she also knew that it would be painful for him, that it would reopen old wounds, that it would force him to confront the ghosts of his past. She found him in his study, poring over a map of the surrounding lands. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with fatigue and worry. "Cecily," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. "What is it?" She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. I found something," she said, her voice trembling. "In the garden. In the tool shed." She held out the box. He looked at it, his eyes narrowing. "What is this?" he asked. "Letters," she said. "From Lyra." His face paled. He reached out, his hand trembling, and took the box. He opened it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting.
He didn't speak for a long time.
He simply sat there, staring at the letters, his expression unreadable. Cecily felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had intruded upon his grief, his privacy, and she had no right to do so. I am sorry," she whispered, her voice filled with remorse. "I shouldn't have read them." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that she had never seen before. "It's all right," he said, his voice hoarse. "You had no way of knowing." He closed the box, his hand lingering on its surface. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "for finding them." He stood up, walking to the window, his back to her. He stood there for a long time, staring out at the darkening landscape, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his memories. Cecily watched him, her heart aching for him. The echoes of a lost love, resonating in the silence of the study, had brought them to a new, fragile understanding. But the path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with danger and the ever-present threat of the looming rebellion. And Cecily knew that she could not remain silent forever, that she would soon have to make a choice that could shatter the fragile peace they had found, or perhaps forge a stronger, more enduring bond. Chapter 14. Beneath a Blood Moon. The tension at Northwood continued to mount. Warwick, driven by the escalating threat of rebellion, implemented stricter security measures, increasing patrols, fortifying the manor house, and drilling his men relentlessly. He seemed to be preparing for a siege, anticipating an attack at any moment. Cecily, burdened by her secret knowledge of Edmund's involvement, found herself increasingly isolated, caught between her loyalty to the king and her love for her brother. She longed to confide in Warwick, to share the burden of her knowledge, but she feared the consequences, fearing his reaction, fearing the inevitable rift it would create between them. One night, a blood moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an eerie, reddish glow over the landscape. The unusual celestial event heightened the sense of unease, fueling superstitious fears among the servants and adding to the general atmosphere of anxiety. Cecily found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She rose from her bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and ventured out into the garden. The air was cold and still, the silence broken only by the distant hooting of an owl. She walked to the spot where she had placed Lyra's statue, the stone figure bathed in the blood-red moonlight, its features seemingly animated, its eyes filled with a strange, haunting sadness. She sat down on a nearby bench, her gaze fixed on the statue, her thoughts drifting back to the letters she had found, to Lyra's words, to her love for Warwick, to her tragic death. She felt a presence behind her. She turned, startled. It was Warwick. He stood there, silhouetted against the blood moon, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of what? Sadness? Longing? "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her own throat tight with emotion. He walked towards her, stopping beside the statue. He looked at it, his gaze lingering on its features. "She loved this garden," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Cecily nodded again, unable to speak. He sat down beside her on the bench, a careful distance between them. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the night breeze. I miss her," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Cecily felt tears welling up in her eyes. She reached out, her hand instinctively touching his arm. It was a gesture of comfort, of empathy, of shared loss. He didn't pull away. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. He turned his hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. It was a small gesture, a simple touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her, a surprising, unsettling sensation. They sat there, their hands clasped together, the blood moon casting its eerie glow upon them, a silent witness to their shared moment of vulnerability, of connection. "I know about your brother," he said, his voice suddenly firm, breaking the silence. Cecily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart leaped into her throat. How had he found out? She tried to pull her hand away, but he held it fast. "Alara?" he said, answering her unspoken question. "The other Alara. She told me." Alara. The old woman from the forest. She had seen, she had known, she had revealed. Cecily felt a wave of betrayal wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by relief. The secret was out. The burden was lifted. I am sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I should have told you." He shook his head. "It's all right," he said. "I understand. Family, it is a complicated thing." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. "He wants you to join him," he said, his voice low and intense. "He wants you to betray the king." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "He asked me," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I refused." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Why?" he asked. She hesitated, her mind racing. She could lie, she could dissemble, she could pretend to be loyal to the king, to him. But she couldn't. Not anymore.
She began, her voice trembling.
Because I care about you, Nicholas. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected, even to her own ears. She had not planned to say them, had not even realized she felt them, until this very moment. He looked at her, his eyes widening slightly, as if surprised by her confession.
He didn't speak for a long time.
Then he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a fragile expression of a connection that had been forged in the crucible of loss, of betrayal, of shared vulnerability. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense. It was a release, a surrender, a culmination of weeks of unspoken desires, of suppressed emotions. The blood moon, hanging heavy in the sky, bore silent witness to their embrace, to the merging of two wounded souls, to the blossoming of a love that had been born in the shadows, a love that defied logic, that defied expectation, that defied the looming threat of war and rebellion. Beneath the crimson glow, a new chapter had begun, a chapter filled with uncertainty, but also with the fragile promise of a future neither could have predicted, a future where love and loyalty would be tested to their limits. Chapter 15. The Lion's Denver. The kiss beneath the blood moon marked a turning point in Cecily and Warwick's relationship. The walls of reserve, of suspicion, of forced formality had crumbled, replaced by a fragile, nascent intimacy. They were still husband and wife by the king's decree, but they were also something more, something deeper, something forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability and unexpected connection. However, the looming threat of rebellion continued to cast a long shadow over their lives. Warwick, driven by his duty to the king, remained vigilant, preparing for an attack that could come at any moment. He spent most of his time with his men, training, strategizing, reinforcing the defenses of Northwood. Cecily, though relieved that her secret was out, still felt a gnawing anxiety about Edmund. She knew he was out there, plotting, planning, gathering support for his cause. She feared for him, feared for the consequences of his actions, feared the inevitable clash between him and Warwick. One morning, a messenger arrived from the king, bearing a sealed scroll. Warwick read it, his face growing pale, his jaw clenching. "The king summons us to court," he said, his voice tight, with controlled anger. Immediately, Cecily felt a chill run down her spine. This was not good. The king's summons, especially at a time like this, could only mean one thing: trouble. They set out for the capital the following day, accompanied by a small escort of Warwick's most trusted men. The journey was tense, the silence between them punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of hooves and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Cecily tried to gauge Warwick's mood, but he remained impassive, his face a mask of stoicism, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. She wondered what the king wanted, what accusations he might hurl at them, what punishment he might inflict. As they approached the capital, Cecily felt a growing sense of dread. The city, usually bustling with activity, seemed eerily quiet, the streets deserted, the shops shuttered. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with fear. They were met at the gates by a detachment of the king's guard, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. They were escorted, not to the royal palace, but to the dungeons, a dark, forbidding place beneath the castle, where prisoners were held and interrogated. Cecily felt a wave of panic wash over her. This was worse than she had imagined. They were not being summoned as guests, as subjects, but as prisoners. They were separated, Warwick taken to one cell, Cecily to another. Her cell was small, damp and cold, the only light filtering through a tiny, barred window high up in the wall. She was alone, surrounded by the silence of the dungeon, the echoes of past suffering, the fear of the unknown. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. What had happened? What had the king learned? Had Edmund been captured? Had he implicated her? Hours passed, stretching into an eternity. She heard the occasional sound of footsteps, the clanging of keys, the muffled cries of other prisoners. But no one came for her. Finally, as darkness began to fall, the door to her cell opened. A guard stood there, his face impassive. "The king will see you now," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Cecily followed him through the labyrinthine corridors of the dungeon, her legs trembling, her stomach churning with fear. She was led, not to the king's solar, but to the great hall, a vast, imposing space usually reserved for feasts and celebrations. The hall was empty, except for the king, who sat on his throne at the far end of the room, his face illuminated by the flickering light of torches. He was flanked by his advisors, his counselors, his most trusted knights, all of them staring at her with expressions of condemnation, suspicion. Warwick was there, too, standing before the king, his hands bound, his face bruised and bloodied. Cecily felt a surge of relief that he was alive, but also horror at his condition. He had been tortured, interrogated, forced to confess what? She was led to stand beside him, facing the king. The silence in the hall was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the torches and the heavy breathing of those present. "Lady Cecily of Ravensshire," the king said, his voice booming through the hall, his eyes filled with a cold, hard fury. "You stand accused of treason, of conspiring with your brother, Edmund, to overthrow the crown." Treason. The word echoed in her mind, a hollow, mocking sound. She had feared this, had anticipated it, but hearing it spoken aloud, in this setting, before the king and his court, was almost unbearable. I am innocent, your majesty," she said, her voice trembling, but firm. "I have never conspired against you." The king sneered. "Do not lie to me, woman," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "We have proof. Your brother has confessed. He has implicated you." Edmund confessed? Implicated her? Cecily felt a wave of betrayal wash over her. He had sacrificed her, betrayed her, to save himself. She looked at Warwick. His eyes met hers. She saw pain in them, but also something else. Something that looked like understanding? "I did meet with my brother," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I did not conspire with him. I tried to dissuade him." The king laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You expect me to believe that?" he said. "You, the sister of a known traitor, the wife of a man who disappointed me?" He turned to Warwick, his gaze filled with anger. "And you, Sir Nicholas," he said. "You failed me. You allowed this viper to nest in your bosom. You allowed her to betray me." Warwick remained silent, his head bowed, his body bearing the marks of his interrogation. The king rose from his throne, his tall figure looming over them. "You will both be punished," he said, his voice cold and merciless. "You will both pay the price for your treachery." Cecily closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She had entered the lion's den, and she knew that she would not escape unscathed. The price of loyalty, of love, of family, was far higher than she had ever imagined. And as she stood there, facing the king's wrath, she wondered if she would ever see the light of day again, if she would ever escape the darkness that had enveloped her. Chapter 16. Trials of the Heart. The king's pronouncement of judgment hung heavy in the air, a death knell echoing through the silent hall. Cecily, bracing herself for the inevitable, felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. She had faced her fears, she had confessed her truth, and she was prepared to accept the consequences, whatever they might be. But the king's justice, it turned out, was not as swift and merciless as she had anticipated. He did not order their immediate execution, nor did he condemn them to a lifetime of imprisonment in the dungeons. Instead, he decreed a trial. "You will both be given a chance to prove your innocence," he said, his voice still cold and harsh, but with a flicker of something else in his eyes. Perhaps doubt? Or was it merely a cruel game, a way of prolonging their suffering? "You will be subjected to tests," he continued. "Tests of loyalty, of courage, of truth. If you pass these tests, you will be spared. If you fail, you will pay the ultimate price." Cecily and Warwick were separated again, taken back to their cells, to await the commencement of their trials. Cecily found herself in a state of limbo, unsure of what to expect, unsure of how to prepare, unsure of whether to hope or to despair. She thought of Edmund, of his betrayal, of his willingness to sacrifice her to save himself. She felt a surge of anger towards him, but also a lingering sadness, a sense of loss for the brother she had once known and loved. She thought of Warwick, of his bruised and bloodied face, of the pain in his eyes, of the unspoken understanding that had passed between them. She felt a connection to him, a bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity, a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. She thought of the king, of his anger, of his suspicion, of his vulnerability. She realized that he was not simply a cruel tyrant, but a man burdened by the weight of his crown, a man surrounded by enemies, a man desperately trying to maintain control in a world that was spiraling out of control. The first trial came the following day. Cecily was taken from her cell, blindfolded, and led through the labyrinthine corridors of the castle to an unknown destination. She had no idea what awaited her, what test she would be forced to endure. She was taken to a large, open courtyard where a crowd of people had gathered. She could hear their murmurs, their whispers, their anticipation. She could feel their eyes upon her, judging her, condemning her. The blindfold was removed. She found herself standing before a raging fire, a wall of flames that reached towards the sky, its heat intense and unbearable. A voice, amplified by some unseen mechanism, boomed through the courtyard. "Lady Cecily of Ravensshire," the voice said, "you stand accused of treason. To prove your innocence, you must walk through the fire. If you are truly loyal to the king, the flames will not harm you. If you are guilty, you will be consumed. Walk through the fire?" Cecily felt a surge of terror. It was madness, it was suicide. No one could survive such a trial. But she also knew that she had no choice. She had to prove her innocence, not only to the king, but to herself, to Warwick. She looked at the flames, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs trembling. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm her fear. She thought of Warwick, of his love, of his belief in her. She thought of her own strength, her own resilience, her own determination to survive. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the flames. She stepped forward, her body tensing, bracing itself for the inevitable pain. She walked into the fire. The heat was intense, unbearable, searing her skin, burning her lungs. She felt herself dissolving, consumed by the flames. But then, something strange happened. The pain subsided. The heat lessened. She felt a coolness surrounding her, protecting her, shielding her from the fire. She walked through the flames, her eyes wide with disbelief, her body unharmed. She emerged on the other side, unscathed, untouched by the fire. The crowd gasped, their murmurs turning to awe, to wonder. They had witnessed a miracle, a testament to her innocence, a sign of divine intervention. Cecily stood there, shaking, her heart still pounding, but her spirit soaring. She had survived. She had passed the first trial. But she knew that it was not over. There would be more trials, more tests, more challenges. And she knew that she would have to face them all, with courage, with determination, with the unwavering belief in her own innocence, and in the love that had sustained her through the darkness. The trials of the heart, she realized, were far more challenging than any physical ordeal. And it was in these trials that her true strength and her true loyalty would be revealed. Chapter 17. The Unveiling. After Cecily's miraculous survival of the trial by fire, a hush fell over the court. The whispers of doubt and accusation were replaced by murmurs of awe and speculation. The king, though still outwardly stern, could not conceal a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to perish, to be consumed by the flames, proving her guilt beyond any doubt. But she had defied his expectations. She had defied the laws of nature. She had emerged unscathed. Warwick, who had been forced to witness Cecily's ordeal, felt a surge of relief wash over him. He had believed in her innocence. He had trusted in her strength, but he had also feared for her life. Seeing her emerge from the flames unharmed filled him with a renewed sense of hope, a belief that they might yet survive this ordeal, that they might yet find a way to clear their names and reclaim their lives. But the king's justice was not yet satisfied. There were more trials to come, more tests to endure. Cecily and Warwick were returned to their cells, to await the next challenge, the next attempt to break their spirit, to force a confession, to prove their guilt. The second trial came a few days later. This time, it was Warwick who was summoned. Cecily was left alone in her cell, her mind racing, her heart filled with dread. She had no idea what test Warwick would be forced to face, what ordeal he would have to endure. She could only pray for his strength, for his resilience, for his survival. Hours passed, stretching into an eternity. She heard the sounds of the castle, the distant clang of metal, the muffled shouts of guards, the occasional scream of a prisoner, but she had no way of knowing what was happening to Warwick. Finally, as darkness began to fall, the door to her cell opened. A guard stood there, his face impassive. "Come with me," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Cecily followed him through the corridors of the castle, her legs trembling, her stomach churning with fear. She was led, not to the courtyard, nor to the great hall, but to the king's private chambers, a place she had not been since the day of her forced marriage. The chambers were dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a few flickering candles and the embers of a dying fire in the hearth. The king was there, seated on a large, ornate chair, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. Warwick was there, too, standing before the king, his hands unbound, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes defiant. Cecily felt a surge of relief that he was alive, that he had survived his trial. But she also sensed a tension in the air, a sense of impending confrontation. "Lady Cecily," the king said, his voice low and measured, "your husband has been subjected to a test of his loyalty, of his truthfulness." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them both. "He has passed this test," the king continued. "He has proven his innocence, his unwavering loyalty to the crown." Cecily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Warwick was innocent. He had been cleared. He was free. But the king's words held a sting, a hidden barb that made her heart sink. However, the king continued, his voice hardening. "In the course of his interrogation, he revealed certain information. Information that concerns you." Cecily felt a chill run down her spine. What had Warwick revealed? What secret had he confessed? The king turned to Cecily, his eyes piercing. "He told us about your brother," he said. "About your meeting with him. About his rebellion." Cecily's breath caught in her throat. She had known this moment would come. She had feared it. She had anticipated it. But hearing it spoken aloud, in this setting, before the king and Warwick, was almost unbearable. She looked at Warwick. His eyes met hers. She saw pain in them, but also something else. Something that looked like apology. "I had to," Warwick said, his voice barely a whisper. "I had to tell him the truth." Cecily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She understood. He had been forced to choose between his loyalty to the king and his love for her. And he had chosen the king. "You betrayed me," she said, her voice trembling, but firm. He didn't deny it. He simply bowed his head, his body shaking with suppressed emotion. "You will be given one final trial, Lady Cecily," the king said, his voice cold and merciless. "A trial that will determine your ultimate fate." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them both. "You will be given a choice," he continued. "A choice between your loyalty to the crown and your love for your brother." A choice? Cecily felt a surge of confusion. What choice was he offering her? "You will be given the opportunity to capture your brother," the king said. "To bring him to justice. To prove, once and for all, where your true allegiance lies." Capture Edmund? Cecily felt a wave of horror wash over her. She could not do that. She could not betray her brother, even if he had betrayed her. But she also knew that refusing the king's offer would mean certain death, for both her and Warwick. She was trapped. She was caught between two impossible choices, two irreconcilable loyalties. The unveiling of her secret, the revelation of her brother's rebellion, had brought her to this precipice, a point of no return, where she would have to make a decision that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of everyone she loved. And as she stood there, facing the king's ultimatum, she realized that the true trial was not of fire or of interrogation, but of the heart, a test of her deepest values, her most profound beliefs, her ultimate allegiance. Chapter 18. A Storm of Swords. The king's ultimatum, capture Edmund or face death, hung heavy in the air, a suffocating weight that pressed down on Cecily, threatening to crush her spirit. She looked at Warwick, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and understanding. He knew what she was facing. He knew the impossible choice she had to make. She looked at the king, his face stern and unforgiving, his eyes demanding a decision, a pledge of loyalty that would cost her everything. I need time, she said, her voice trembling, but firm. I need time to think. The king hesitated for a moment, his gaze unwavering. He seemed to be weighing her request, assessing her sincerity, calculating the risks. You have until dawn, he finally said, his voice cold and harsh. At dawn, you will give me your answer, and you will act accordingly. Cecily was dismissed, taken back to her cell, to await the coming of dawn, to wrestle with her conscience, to make the most difficult decision of her life. She spent the night in a state of agonizing turmoil, her mind racing, her heart torn between two irreconcilable loyalties. She thought of Edmund, of his betrayal, of his rebellion, of his humanity. She thought of Warwick, of his love, of his sacrifice, of his unwavering loyalty to the king. She thought of the king, of his power, of his justice, of his vulnerability. She realized that he was not simply a cruel tyrant, but a man caught in a web of his own making, a man desperately trying to hold onto his crown, to maintain order in a world that was crumbling around him. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the tiny, barred window of her cell, Cecily finally reached a decision. It was not an easy decision, nor was it a perfect one, but it was the only decision she could make, the only choice that would allow her to live with herself, to preserve her integrity, to honor both her love for her brother and her growing love for Warwick. She was summoned back to the king's chambers. Warwick was there, too, standing before the king, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Have you made your decision, Lady Cecily? The king asked, his voice cold and demanding. Cecily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I have, Your Majesty, she said, her voice trembling, but firm. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. I will not betray my brother, she said, her voice clear and resolute. I will not capture him for you. The king's face darkened with anger. He rose from his chair, his tall figure looming over her. You defy me? He said, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fury. I do not defy you, Your Majesty, Cecily said. I offer you a compromise. A different path. She paused, her gaze sweeping over them both. I will lure my brother to a meeting, she said. A meeting where you can confront him, where you can negotiate with him, where you can perhaps find a peaceful solution to this conflict. A peaceful solution? The king seemed taken aback by her suggestion. It was not what he had expected, not what he had demanded. And why should I trust you? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Why should I believe that you will not betray me again? Cecily looked at Warwick. His eyes met hers. She saw trust in them. She saw belief. She saw love. Because, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Because I am not only Edmund's sister. I am also Nicholas's wife. And I will not betray him. I will not betray us. The king studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her sincerity, calculating the risks. Finally, he nodded. Very well, he said, his voice still cold, but with a flicker of something else in his eyes. Perhaps respect? You will have your chance, he continued. You will lure your brother to a meeting. And I will be there. With my army. An army? Cecily felt a chill run down her spine. This was not a negotiation. This was a trap. But she knew she had no choice. She had made her decision. She had chosen her path, and she would have to follow it to the end, whatever the consequences. The meeting was arranged. Cecily sent a message to Edmund, using a secret code they had devised in their childhood, requesting a meeting at the ancient stone circle, the place where they had reunited weeks before. She knew it was a dangerous gamble, that she was walking into a trap, that she was putting both her brother's life and her own at risk. But she also knew that it was the only way, the only chance to perhaps avert a larger conflict, to prevent a bloody war that would consume the kingdom. The day of the meeting arrived. Cecily and Warwick, accompanied by a small escort of the king's guard, rode to the stone circle. The king and his army were hidden nearby, waiting for the signal, waiting for the moment to strike. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with fear. Cecily felt her heart pounding in her chest, her legs trembling. She was about to face her brother, to betray him, to save him. Edmund arrived, alone, his face wary, his eyes filled with suspicion. He saw Cecily, he saw Warwick, he saw the hidden soldiers. He knew it was a trap. "You betrayed me, sister," he said, his voice cold and harsh. "I did what I had to do, Edmund," Cecily said, her voice trembling. "To save us both." Before Edmund could react, before he could escape, the king's army emerged from their hiding places, surrounding the stone circle, their swords drawn, their faces grim. A storm of swords erupted. The clash of metal, the cries of men, the screams of the dying, filled the air. Cecily found herself caught in the middle of the chaos, the battle raging around her, the fate of her brother, of her husband, of her kingdom, hanging in the balance. The peaceful solution she had hoped for had dissolved into a bloody confrontation, a test of loyalty and love played out beneath the ancient stones, where the past and the present collided in a desperate struggle for the future. Chapter 19. The Raven's Flight. The battle at the stone circle was swift and brutal. Edmund, despite being outnumbered and surrounded, fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his sword a blur of silver in the fading light. He was a skilled warrior, trained in the arts of combat since childhood, and he had the advantage of desperation, of fighting for his life, for his cause, for his freedom. Cecily watched in horror as the fighting raged around her, the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the screams of the dying, filling her ears. She saw Warwick, fighting alongside the king's men, his face grim and determined, his sword stained with blood. She saw Edmund, his face contorted with rage and despair, his movements becoming increasingly frantic, his defenses weakening. She knew that he could not win, that he was doomed to be captured or killed. And she knew that she had played a part in his downfall, that she had lured him into this trap, that she had betrayed him, even if it was for his own good. She saw an opportunity, a brief moment when Edmund was separated from the main body of the fighting, his back turned to her. She could intervene, she could save him, she could betray the king again. She didn't hesitate. She ran towards Edmund, shouting his name, her voice barely audible above the din of battle. "Edmund," she cried. "Run. Escape. While you still can." Edmund turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He saw her. He saw the desperation in her eyes. He saw the love that still burned within her, despite everything. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering between her and the approaching soldiers. Then he nodded, a single, curt nod that conveyed his understanding, his gratitude. He turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the forest, his raven symbol a fleeting glimpse of defiance against the encroaching darkness. Cecily stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs trembling. She had done it. She had betrayed the king. She had betrayed Warwick. She had betrayed her vows. But she had also saved her brother. She had given him a chance to escape, to live, to perhaps fight another day. The king's men, realizing that Edmund had escaped, turned their attention to Cecily. They surrounded her, their swords pointed at her, their faces filled with anger and accusation. Warwick, seeing what had happened, rushed towards her, his face a mixture of shock and understanding. "Cecily,"
he cried.
"what have you done?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I had to," she whispered. "I had to save him." The king arrived, his face a mask of fury. He had witnessed Cecily's actions, he had seen her betrayal, he had seen his prize escape. "You traitor!" he roared, his voice shaking with rage. "You will pay for this." He raised his hand, signaling his men to seize her to kill her. But before they could act, Warwick stepped forward, placing himself between Cecily and the king, his sword drawn, his face defiant. "No," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "She is my wife. I will protect her." The king stared at Warwick, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had not expected this. He had not anticipated this defiance, this betrayal from his most trusted knight. "You would defy me?" the king said, his voice incredulous. "For her?" Warwick nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I would," he said. "I love her." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected, a declaration of love made in the midst of chaos, of betrayal, of impending doom. The king looked at them both, his face a mixture of anger, disappointment, and something else. Something that looked like understanding? He lowered his hand, signaling his men to stand down. "Very well," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "You have both made your choices. And you will both live with the consequences." He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the darkness, leaving Cecily and Warwick alone, surrounded by the aftermath of the battle, the bodies of the fallen, the echoes of the fighting. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They had survived. They had defied the king. They had declared their love. But they had also made enemies. They had broken vows. They had chosen a path that would lead them where? The Raven's flight, Cecily realized, had not only saved Edmund, but had also freed her and Warwick from the chains of duty, of obligation, of forced loyalty. They were now outcasts, rebels, fugitives. But they were also together. And in that togetherness, in that shared defiance, in that unexpected love, they found a strength, a resilience, a hope that would sustain them through whatever trials and tribulations lay ahead. The future was uncertain, the path unclear, but they would face it together, two souls bound by a love that had blossomed in the shadows, a love that had defied all odds, a love that would be their guiding light in the darkness. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The aftermath of the battle at the Stone Circle left Cecily and Warwick in a precarious position. They were fugitives, branded as traitors by the king, their lives forfeit, their future uncertain. They had chosen love over duty, defiance over submission, and they knew that they would have to face the consequences of their actions. They fled northward, knowing that it was no longer safe for them, that the king's wrath would soon reach its gates. They traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads, seeking refuge in the dense forests and remote villages, relying on the kindness of strangers and the loyalty of a few trusted friends. They were not alone. Mistress Alara, ever loyal, ever resourceful, had anticipated their flight and had prepared provisions, supplies, and a network of contacts who would help them along the way. She had also, surprisingly, revealed a hidden talent for disguise, transforming Cecily and Warwick into humble travelers, their noble features obscured by simple clothing and carefully applied dirt and grime. Their journey was arduous, filled with hardship and danger. They slept under the stars, ate whatever they could find, and constantly looked over their shoulders, fearing pursuit, fearing capture. But they also found moments of peace, of connection, of love. They shared stories, they shared dreams, they shared the simple joys of survival, of being together, of defying the odds. They learned to rely on each other, to trust each other, to support each other. Cecily, no longer the pampered noblewoman, discovered a strength and resilience she never knew she possessed. She learned to hunt, to forage, to defend herself, to live off the land. Warwick, no longer the stoic knight, allowed himself to be vulnerable, to express his emotions, to embrace the love that had blossomed between them. As they traveled, They began to hear rumors of other rebellions, of other groups rising up against the king's rule. They realized that Edmund's actions had not been isolated, that there was a growing discontent throughout the kingdom, a yearning for change, for justice, for freedom. They also learned that the king's response had been brutal, his armies sweeping across the land, crushing any resistance, punishing any suspected traitors, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. Cecily felt a growing sense of responsibility for the chaos that had engulfed the kingdom. She had played a part in it. She had fueled the flames of rebellion, even if unintentionally. And she knew that she could not simply run and hide, that she had to do something to try to make amends, to try to bring about a peaceful resolution to the conflict. She decided to seek out Edmund, to find him, to talk to him, to persuade him to lay down his arms, to negotiate with the king, to prevent further bloodshed. Warwick, though initially reluctant, agreed to support her. He knew that it was a dangerous gamble, that it could lead them straight into the king's hands, but he also knew that it was the right thing to do, the only way to perhaps find a way out of this endless cycle of violence and betrayal. They followed the rumors, the whispers, the fragmented reports of Edmund's movements, until they finally tracked him down to a hidden encampment deep within the ancient forest, the same forest where Cecily had first met Alara, the same forest where so many secrets had been revealed. Edmund was surprised to see them, his face a mixture of suspicion and relief. He had believed them to be dead, captured, executed by the king. "Cecily," he said, his voice hoarse. "Nicholas, what are you doing here?" Cecily explained their situation, their flight from Northwood, their desire for peace, their hope that he would reconsider his rebellion. Edmund listened intently, his expression unreadable. He was surrounded by his followers, his loyal warriors, his brothers in arms. They were a hardened group, scarred by battle, driven by a fierce determination to overthrow the king, to create a new world, a world free from tyranny. "You ask me to surrender?" he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "To lay down my arms? To trust the king?" "I ask you to negotiate," Cecily said.
To talk.
"To find a compromise. To prevent further bloodshed." Edmund laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "There can be no compromise with a tyrant," he said. "Only victory or death." He turned to his followers, his voice rising in a passionate call to arms. "We will fight," he cried. "We will fight for our freedom. We will fight for our future. We will fight until the king is overthrown and justice is restored to this land." His followers roared their approval, their swords raised, their faces filled with a fierce determination. Cecily felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had failed. She had not been able to persuade Edmund. She had not been able to prevent the inevitable clash, the final confrontation between the rebels and the king. But then, Warwick stepped forward, his voice calm and resolute. "There is another way," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled warriors. He spoke of his own experiences, of his own loyalty to the king, of his own disillusionment. He spoke of the king's mistakes, of his tyranny, of his vulnerability. He spoke of the need for change, for justice, for a better world. But he also spoke of the futility of violence, of the endless cycle of bloodshed, of the innocent lives that would be lost. He spoke of the need for negotiation, for compromise, for peace. His words, spoken with sincerity and conviction, resonated with some of the rebels. They began to question, to doubt, to reconsider their blind loyalty to Edmund, their unwavering commitment to violence. A division arose within the ranks of the rebellion. Some remained loyal to Edmund, determined to fight to the death. Others, swayed by Warwick's words, began to waver, to question the wisdom of their cause. The reckoning of love and duty had come, not only for Cecily and Warwick, but for Edmund and his followers as well. The future of the kingdom hung in the balance, resting on the choices they would make, on the paths they would choose, on the sacrifices they were willing to make. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the ancient forest, the final confrontation loomed, a confrontation not only of armies, but of ideals, of beliefs, of the very essence of what it meant to be loyal, to be just, to be free. Epilogue. The schism within Edmund's ranks proved to be the turning point. While some remained fiercely loyal to him and his vision of violent overthrow, a significant number, swayed by Warwick's words and Cecily's pleas for peace, chose to lay down their arms. They were tired of the bloodshed, weary of the constant fear, and disillusioned with the promises of a rebellion that seemed to offer only more violence and destruction. Edmund, seeing his support dwindling, his dream of a triumphant uprising crumbling before his eyes, was forced to reconsider his position. He realized that he could not win, that continuing the fight would only lead to more death and suffering, ultimately achieving nothing. With a heavy heart, but a clear mind, Edmund agreed to negotiate with the king. A meeting was arranged, not in the grandeur of the royal court, but in the neutral territory of the ancient stone circle, the place where so much had been lost and so much had been found. The king, though initially reluctant to compromise, was also facing growing unrest within his own ranks. The rebellion, though weakened, had exposed the cracks in his authority, the discontent among his people, the vulnerability of his reign. He realized that he could not continue to rule through fear and oppression, that he needed to find a way to appease his subjects, to regain their trust, to restore stability to his kingdom. The negotiations were long and arduous, filled with tension and mistrust. But ultimately, a compromise was reached. Edmund agreed to disband his remaining forces, to renounce his claim to the throne, to accept a pardon for himself and his followers. In return, the king agreed to implement certain reforms, to address the grievances of the people, to ease the burden of taxation, to release political prisoners, to rule with a more just and compassionate hand. Cecily and Warwick, though still technically fugitives, were instrumental in facilitating the negotiations, acting as intermediaries between the two sides, bridging the gap of mistrust, helping to forge a path towards peace. Once the agreement was finalized, the king, in a surprising move, issued a full pardon for Cecily and Warwick, acknowledging their role in bringing about the peaceful resolution, recognizing their loyalty, not to his crown, but to the greater good of the kingdom. They returned to Northwood, not as fugitives, but as heroes, welcomed by the cheers of the people, the gratitude of the servants, the respect of the guards. They had risked everything, they had defied the king, they had chosen love over duty, and they had, against all odds, succeeded in bringing about a change, a transformation not only in their own lives, but in the lives of everyone in the kingdom. They restored the garden, transforming it into a symbol of hope, of renewal, of the enduring power of love and compassion. They ruled Northwood together, not as lord and lady, but as partners, as equals, as lovers. They created a community based on justice, on fairness, on respect for all. Years passed. The kingdom flourished. The scars of the rebellion gradually healed. The king, though still stern and demanding, learned to listen to his people, to rule with wisdom and compassion. Cecily and Warwick had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in a world that was different from the one their parents had known, a world where peace was not a fragile dream, but a tangible reality. And as they grew old, sitting together in the garden they had restored, watching their children play, their grandchildren frolic, they knew that they had made the right choices, that they had fought the good fight, that they had found a love that was worth more than any crown, any kingdom, any duty. Their journey, born in the shadows of the king's watchful eye, had led them through trials of fire, of loyalty, of the heart, to a place of peace, of contentment, of enduring love. A love that had transformed a kingdom, and a love that would forever be etched in the annals of history, a testament to the power of courage, of compassion, and of the unwavering belief in a better world. The reckoning had come, and love had prevailed. The end.